Hey guys, my name is Evan and welcome to Evanomics 101, your number one source for everything econ. Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that a group of just a few thousand people collectively control more than $20 trillion in wealth. Now imagine that at the same time, millions of ordinary people are worrying about housing, groceries, interest rate, wages, and whether their paycheck is actually keeping up with the cost of living. So here's the uncomfortable truth. If you have more money than you could realistically spend in several lifetimes, do you have a moral obligation to use some of it to fix the economy? And I'm not asking whether billionaires can donate money. I'm asking whether they should. Because there's a huge difference between being generous and believing that extraordinary wealth creates extraordinary responsibility. Today we're going to break this down from an economics perspective, not just a political one. First, we'll look at just how enormous billionaire wealth has become and what the wealth actually represents. Second, we'll ask whether billionaires could realistically solve problems like inflation, economic inequality, or whether the idea misunderstands how the economy really works. And finally, we'll look at what this means for the Federal Reserve, financial markets, and consumers. Before we jump into the video, I do have a quick favor that really helps grow the channel. If you enjoy simple breakdowns of economics, please hit the like button and subscribe to Evanomics 101. Now let's go ahead and get to the video. So first, we need to understand the number that we're talking about. According to Forbes' 2026 World Billionaire list, there are almost 3,500 billionaires worldwide with combined wealth of approximately $20 trillion. That's a record, and it's about 4 million more than the previous year. Think about that. $20 trillion, that's not sitting inside one giant bank account. And that's one of the most important things to understand about billionaire wealth. A net worth usually consists largely of ownership stakes in companies, stocks, real estate, investments, and all type of assets. So if someone is worth 100 billion, that doesn't mean they have 100 billion sitting in cash. Their wealth can rise if the companies they own become more valuable. And that's where the debate gets a little complicated, because someone can become dramatically richer on paper without receiving billions of dollars in the form of a paycheck. But here's the bigger point. Even though much of this wealth isn't cash, it still represents economic power. If you own a huge percentage of a company, you can influence how that company invests, hires, pays workers, develops products, and allocate capital. You can also influence philanthropy, politics, technology, and sometimes the whole industry or the entire industry. So when people argue that billionaires have a special responsibility, they're not necessarily talking about a billionaire literally writing a $100 billion check. They're talking about the power that comes from controlling enormous amounts of capital. And that brings us to the next question. What could that capital actually accomplish? Here's where I think the debate gets a little more interesting. Because saying billionaires should fix the economy, it sounds simple. But economically, it's nothing but simple. Take inflation, all right? So as of 2026, U.S. consumer prices were up 3.4% over previous years. Core inflation was 2.5%. Could billionaires donate money to people struggling with higher prices? Absolutely they could. Could they build affordable housing? Yep, absolutely. They could do that too. Could they invest in different type of businesses? Absolutely. But can they simply make inflation disappear? Not really. So inflation is a macroeconomic problem involving supply and demand, wages, energy, monetary policy, expectations, fiscal policy, and global economic conditions. That's why the Federal Reserve exists. As of the meeting, the federal funds target range was 3.5% to 3.775%, while the Fed said inflation remained elevated relative to the 2% goal. I can't just walk into the Federal Reserve and say, I take care of inflation. That's not how monetary policy works. And the same thing applies to unemployment. In July, the unemployment rate was 4.1%, while payroll employment actually declined by 23,000 that month. A billionaire can create jobs, but one billionaire can't redesign the entire U.S. labor market. So maybe the better question is, what economic problems are billionaires uniquely positioned to help solve? And that distinction matters. So let's say a billionaire donate, okay? That could fund a hospital, or it could build finance medical research. It could help people after you have some type of, and those things can have enormous social value. But charity doesn't necessarily change the underlying economic system. If the billionaire owns a company employing hundreds of thousands of people, they could also influence wages, benefits, working conditions, training, and career opportunities. That's a different kind of economic impact. And that is where I think the moral argument becomes much stronger, because the question isn't simply, should rich people give away their money? The deeper question is, do people who accumulate extraordinary wealth have a responsibility to consider the consequences of how that wealth is created and used? That's a much harder question, because capitalism allows people to become extraordinarily wealthy when they create something that millions of people value. And that's not inherently bad. In fact, billion-dollar fortunes can be evidence of enormous economic value creation. But wealth creation and social responsibility aren't mutually exclusive. And that leads directly to the strongest argument against the idea that billionaires have an obligation. Here's I'm going to go into do billionaires have a financial obligation to fix the economy? The economy is not supposed to be run by billionaires. It's supposed to be governed through institutions. Congress writes tax laws, government spends public money, the Federal Reserve manages monetary policy, businesses create jobs and investment. Consumers make spending decisions, and voters ultimately decide who gets political power. If we decide that billionaires could or should personally solve economic problems, we may actually be asking private individuals to do the job of public institutions. Quick pause, guys. If you want more breakdowns like this, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to Economics 101. And here's the question I want you thinking about while continue. If you had more money than you could ever realistically spend, would you consider giving a large portion of it away? Or would you argue that you already earned it and should be free to keep it? Because the answer to the question tells us a lot about how we think about wealth, markets, and responsibility. Now, let's take it a step further. So the most important point is that billionaire behavior can influence the economy, but it doesn't replace macroeconomic policy. Look at where the U.S. economy stands right now. Real GDP grew at 1.5% annualized, down from 2.1% in quarter one. The slowdown reflected weaker government spending and slower investment and exports, partially offset by stronger consumer spending. Meanwhile, inflation is still above Fed's target. That creates a difficult environment. The Fed has to think about inflation and employment. Markets have to think about interest rates, earnings, investments, and economic growth. Consumers have to think about prices, wages, debt, housing, and purchasing power. So where do billionaires fit in this? They can affect investment, they can affect business creation, they can affect employment, and through philanthropy and political influence, they can affect society in ways that are much larger than their personal consumption, but they don't control the entire economy. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think billionaires have a moral obligation to give back and help fix economic problems? Or do you believe their only obligation is to follow the law, pay taxes, and manage their own wealth however they see fit? Drop your comments below. If you enjoyed the breakdown, like the video, subscribe to Economics 101, and turn your notifications on so you don't ever miss a future video. This is Economics 101, your #1 source for every econ. I'll see you on the next video.